June 1988, Harland County. The air was heavy with the smell of wet earth and diesel. For 3 days, a slow, persistent rain had fallen, turning the fairgrounds into a patchwork of standing water and saturated soil. It was the final day of the Harland County Annual Farm Show, an event that was usually a celebration of sun-dried hay and the promise of a good harvest. This year it was a testament to the stubbornness of farmers and the resilience of their machines against the elements. Arthur Croft stood near the edge of the demonstration field, a place where new equipment was meant to prove its worth. At 72, he was a fixture in this landscape, as weathered and deeply rooted as the old oak trees that lined the county roads. His face was a map of his years, creased by sun and concentration. He wore simple denim overalls, scuffed leather boots caked with the same mud that covered the field, and a faded flannel shirt that had seen more seasons than most of the men attending the show. He stood with his hands resting lightly on his hips, his posture one of patient observation. He did not speak. He watched. The problem was a machine. Not just any machine, but the centerpiece of the entire show, the Titan Agrodynamics Vulcan 9500. It was an articulated four-wheel drive tractor of immense proportions, its tires taller than a man. Its paint was a gleaming, aggressive red, untouched by the honest wear of a working life. It boasted a 500-horsepower engine, a climate-controlled cab with a dozen computer screens, and a price tag that could purchase several small farms in the county. It was currently buried up to its axles in the soft, dark clay of the demonstration field. The tractor had become stuck an hour earlier, during what was supposed to be a triumphant display of its power. A young, confident salesman from the city, a man named Mark Renshaw, had been at the controls, narrating its features over a loudspeaker system. He had intended to pull a 24-bottom plow through the wet ground, a feat meant to inspire awe. Instead, the massive tires had lost their purchase and began to dig. In his eagerness to demonstrate power, Renshaw had ignored the ground's quiet warning. The Vulcan 9500, a machine designed to conquer the Earth, had instead been swallowed by it. The plow, a long spine of polished steel, lay behind it like a discarded ambition. This particular field, the southern pasture of the old Hemlock Farm, was notorious. Arthur knew its history. His father had known its history. It was a basin of dense marl clay, hidden under a deceptively thin layer of topsoil. For generations, farmers had learned to work it early in the spring or late in the fall, when it was either firm with frost or baked hard by the sun. They learned not to challenge it after a long rain. It was a lesson taught not in a manual, but by the land itself, often through the bitter experience of a bogged-down tractor and a lost day of work. Over the years, many had tried to fix the field. In the 50s, the county had brought in engineers who recommended extensive and costly drainage tile systems, but the clay was too dense and deep. The water had nowhere to go. In the 70s, a corporate farm that leased it for a few years tried to amend the soil with thousands of tons of sand and lime. They succeeded only in creating a concrete-like substance that broke 2 disc harrows before they gave up. The field had a character, a will of its own, and it did not yield to force or fashionable solutions. It had humbled many men and many machines, but never one so large, so expensive, and so publicly. The failure of the Vulcan 9500 was not just a logistical problem, it was a spectacle. Mark Renshaw stood beside the mired tractor, his crisp, company-logoed polo shirt now spattered with mud. His face, once beaming with sales-driven optimism, was tight with frustration and embarrassment. He spoke into a walkie-talkie, his voice sharp and strained. He was a man of systems and specifications, of horsepower ratings and torque curves printed on glossy brochures. The raw physical reality of the situation, the sheer unyielding grip of the mud, was an anomaly his training had not prepared him for. His first solution was predictable. He called for more power. Another large, modern tractor, a competitor's model from a neighboring booth, was brought over. It was a bright green machine, nearly as large as the Vulcan, and it was hooked to the front of the stuck tractor with a thick, yellow synthetic rope. Renshaw directed the operation with shouted commands, a man trying to reassert control over a narrative that had spiraled away from him. The green tractor strained, its own tires spinning, churning the mud into a deeper, sloppier soup. The rope went taut, stretched, and then, with a loud snap that echoed across the field, it broke. The recoil whipped the frayed end back against the green tractor's grill, leaving a sharp crack in the plastic. The Vulcan had not moved an inch. It had perhaps settled a little deeper. A small crowd of farmers had gathered, their initial interest in the new technology replaced by a more familiar, timeless form of rural entertainment, watching a proud man in a difficult spot. They stood with their arms crossed, offering quiet, unhelpful commentary to one another. They were a chorus of seasoned skepticism. They had seen this story before, though never on such a grand scale. Their faces held a mixture of sympathy and a certain grim satisfaction. The land, their constant adversary and partner, had reminded the city boy that it still had the final say. Arthur Croft remained at the edge of the scene, separate from the murmuring crowd. His grandson, Leo, a quiet boy of 16, stood beside him. Leo watched the failed rescue attempt with wide eyes. He looked at the massive, helpless machine, then up at his grandfather. Arthur's gaze was fixed on the Vulcan's tires, on the way the mud clung to the deep treads, on the angle at which the machine had sunk. He was not watching the spectacle. He was reading the problem. Renshaw's second attempt involved two tractors pulling in tandem. This only resulted in more spinning wheels and a deeper rutting of the field. The smell of hot clutches and overworked diesel engines mingled with the scent of the rain-soaked earth. Renshaw threw his company cap on the ground in a gesture of pure exasperation. He paced back and forth, his polished sales pitch replaced by muttered curses. He saw the problem as a failure of force. He believed that if he could just apply enough horsepower, the laws of physics would have to capitulate. He was wrong. It was then that one of the older farmers in the crowd, a man named Henderson, who had known Arthur for 50 years, pointed a thumb in his direction. "Well, Mark," Henderson said, his voice carrying a note of dry amusement, "if you're done playing with the new toys, maybe you should ask Arthur Croft. He's pulled more iron out of this county's mud than any man alive." Several men in the crowd chuckled. It was meant as a gentle jibe, a piece of local colour for the out-of-towner. Renshaw followed Henderson's gesture and saw Arthur for the first time. He saw an old man in worn clothes standing next to a boy. His gaze then drifted past them, to the edge of the parking lot where Arthur had parked his machine. It was a 1973 Case 1370 Agri King. Its orange paint was faded to a pale persimmon, chipped and scarred from decades of work. The silver of the grille was tarnished, and the seat cushion was patched with duct tape. By the standards of the modern farm show, it was an antique, a relic from a bygone era. Renshaw looked at the old tractor, then back at his own $500,000 machine buried in the mud. He gave a short, incredulous laugh. The sound was sharp and dismissive. "Right," he said, the sarcasm thick in his voice. "Bring the museum piece over. Maybe the mud will die of shock." He turned his back on Arthur, dismissing the suggestion and the man in a single motion. He was humiliated, and his pride lashed out at the easiest target. The men in the crowd fell silent. Henderson's joke had landed wrong, curdled by the city man's arrogance. The laughter died. They looked from Renshaw's stiff back to Arthur's quiet form. They knew Arthur. They knew his ways. He was a man of few words and old methods. Most of them had upgraded their equipment over the years, embracing the bigger, faster, more comfortable machines that filled the fairgrounds. They saw Arthur's continued reliance on his old case as a sign of stubbornness, or perhaps of being left behind by the march of progress. They respected him as a man, but they saw his tools as obsolete. The idea of that old tractor succeeding where the new ones had failed was, on its face, absurd. Their silence was a form of agreement with Renshaw. Arthur's expression did not change. He had heard the comment, he had felt the shift in the crowd. It did not matter. Their opinions were like the weather, present, observable, but ultimately beyond his control and not worth his energy. He was not concerned with Renshaw's pride or the crowd's amusement. He was occupied with the geometry of the problem. His mind was not on the people, but on the ground beneath their feet. As he watched the frantic, useless activity around the Vulcan, his mind drifted back, a quiet retreat into the landscape of memory. He was no longer at the noisy, muddy farm show of 1988. He was in this same field, in the spring of 1949. He was a boy of 13, and the rain had been just as relentless. His father, Samuel Croft, was with him. Samuel Croft was a man carved from the same hard hickory as the handles of his tools. He spoke even less than Arthur did, but when he did speak, his words had the weight of carefully chosen stones. They had been trying to get the last of the spring ploughing done before the planting window closed. They were using a much smaller machine, an Alice Chalmers Model C, a tractor that would have looked like a garden toy next to the Vulcan 9500. Samuel had been driving, and he too had misjudged the soil's saturation. The little tractor, pulling a two-bottom plough, had sunk just as surely as the Vulcan had, its narrow rear wheels spinning uselessly in the slick grey clay. Arthur, as a boy, had reacted with a child's impatience. He had wanted to run and get their neighbour, to fetch a bigger tractor, to apply more force. His father had simply switched off the engine. The sudden silence was profound. There was only the sound of the rain dripping from the brim of his father's hat. Samuel had climbed down from the seat, his movements slow and deliberate. He did not curse. He did not kick the tires. He walked a slow circle around the stuck machine, his boots making soft, sucking sounds in the mud. He was not looking at the tractor. He was looking at the earth it was trapped in. He had crouched down, scooping up a handful of the mud. He rubbed it between his thumb and forefinger, feeling its texture. "See this, son?" he had said, his voice quiet. "This ain't dirt. Not today. Today it's glue. Marl clay. Holds water like a bucket. The more you spin your wheels, the more you polish it. You turn it into grease. You can have all the horsepower in the world, but it won't do you a lick of good if you ain't got nothing to push against." That was the first lesson. Power was not the answer. His father had then articulated the core principle, the central thesis of a lifetime spent working with the land. He had looked at his son, his gaze direct and clear. "It ain't about power, Arthur. It's about purchase. The ground tells you how to pull. You just have to listen. Power without grip is just noise and smoke. It's a waste of good diesel and a good day." Samuel had sent Arthur to the fence row to gather flat field stones and broken pieces of slate. He had him fetch 2 long, thick oak planks they always carried on the wagon. They didn't have another tractor to pull them out. They had only the tractor itself, a long-handled spade, and what was in their heads. Samuel spent the next 2 hours digging. He didn't dig in front of the tires. He dug beside them, creating shallow trenches. He laid the planks and the stones in the trenches, creating a new surface, a foundation of friction for the tires to find. He taught Arthur another lesson that day. "Weight is a tool," he had said, gesturing to the heavy cast iron of the tractor's rear end. "But it can also be an anchor. Right now, all this weight is your enemy. It's pushing you deeper into the glue. The trick ain't to pull it forward. The trick is to lift it up, just a little, so it can get on top of the ground instead of being in it. You change the direction of the problem." They had used a long pry bar and blocks of wood, painstakingly lifting one side of the tractor's axle a fraction of an inch at a time, sliding more stones underneath the tire. It was slow, arduous work. It was about leverage, not force. When they were done, the tractor was no longer sunk in the mud, but resting on a crude, hidden causeway of their own making. Samuel got back on the seat, started the engine, and put it in the lowest gear. The tractor crept forward, the tires biting on the stones and planks, and pulled itself free. He hadn't spun the tires once. Standing there in 1988, watching Mark Renshaw make every mistake his father had taught him to avoid, Arthur felt the memory as if it were yesterday. The lessons were not abstract theory. They were physical truths learned through the ache in his back and the mud under his fingernails. These were the principles he had lived by for 50 years. His knowledge was not just a collection of memories, it had a physical form. Back in his workshop, locked in a heavy metal filing cabinet, was a set of spiral-bound notebooks. They were the maintenance logs for the Case 1370. The first entry was dated October 1973, the day he and his father had driven it home from the dealership. Every oil change, every filter replacement, every tire rotation, every engine repair was recorded in his neat, blocky handwriting. The logs chronicled the tractor's life, the hours on the engine, the type of oil used, the torque settings for the head bolts, the part numbers for the hydraulic filters. This meticulous record-keeping was another of his father's lessons. "A machine is a conversation," Samuel used to say. "You listen to it. You write down what it tells you, a strange noise, a drop in pressure, a bit of smoke. You write it down. Over time, you'll learn its language. You'll know what it needs before it breaks." To Arthur, that tractor was not just a piece of equipment. It was a partner. He knew its every gear whine, every hydraulic groan. He knew the precise feel of the clutch engaging. This deep, intimate knowledge stood in stark contrast to the disposable, computer-diagnosed machinery of the modern era, where a farmer was often a mere operator, dependent on a dealership technician to interpret the data from a laptop. Arthur was the technician. The logs were his diagnostic code. The organizers of the farm show were now in a state of quiet panic. The failure of the flagship tractor was a disaster. It made the manufacturer look incompetent and the show itself look foolish. The field was chewed up, the schedule was ruined, and the centerpiece of their event was an immovable monument to failure. The show manager, a man named Peters, conferred with Renshaw. Their voices were low and tense. They had run out of modern options. Finally, Peters, his face grim with resignation, walked over to the crowd. He ignored Henderson and the others. He walked directly to Arthur Croft. "Arthur," he said, his voice stripped of its usual bluster. "They can't get it out. They've tried everything they can think of." He paused, a man swallowing his pride. "Henderson said that you know this field. Is there anything you can do?" Arthur looked from Peter's worried face to the stuck tractor. He saw the deep ruts, the broken tow rope, the general chaos. He saw Renshaw watching him, a look of desperate hope now warring with the arrogant condescension on his face. Arthur didn't answer immediately. He simply looked at the problem, his mind calculating angles and weights and soil densities. The math did not require a pencil. He turned to his grandson. "Leo," he said, his voice calm and low, "go to the truck, get the chain, and the oak planks. Both of them." Leo nodded, his expression serious. He understood the significance of the request. The chain was not an ordinary tow chain. It was a length of half-inch, grade 80 logging chain, each link thick as a man's thumb. It was heavy, powerful, and utterly without stretch. The planks were the same ones his great-grandfather had used, or ones just like them, 12 feet long, 3 inches thick, and a foot wide, scarred and stained from decades of use. They were his unconventional tools, born of old necessities. Arthur walked away from the edge of the field, his boots making a steady, unhurried rhythm on the wet grass. He walked toward his tractor. The crowd parted to let him pass, a quiet ripple of anticipation moving through them. They had mocked this machine with their laughter, dismissed it with their silence. Now it was the only option left. He did not get on the tractor immediately. He began his work with a walk. He circled the mired Vulcan 9500, but he kept his distance, staying on the firmer ground. He was pacing out distances, judging the slope of the land, which was almost imperceptible to the untrained eye. He was looking for the spine of the field, a slightly higher, firmer ridge of ground that ran diagonally across the pasture. His father had shown it to him decades ago. It was the path they always took when the ground was soft. He stopped and scuffed the turf with his boot, revealing the soil beneath. It was darker here, more loam than clay. It had better drainage. This would be his anchor point. He then walked toward the stuck tractor, his steps becoming more careful as the ground softened. He did not approach it from the front, where the other tractors had tried to pull. He walked to the side, at roughly a 45-degree angle to the Vulcan's nose. He knelt, just as his father had done, and scooped up a handful of the mud from beside the deeply buried front tire. He felt its slick, greasy texture. It was just as he had expected. Polished clay. By the time Leo returned, struggling under the weight of the chain and dragging the planks, Arthur had his plan. He didn't explain it to Renshaw or Peters. He spoke only to his grandson. "Put the planks there," he said, pointing to a spot well behind the place he intended to position his own tractor. He was preparing his own ground first, ensuring he would not suffer the same fate as the Vulcan. He then walked back to his Case 1370 and climbed into the cab. The seat creaked under his weight. The cab was simple, a cage of steel and glass with none of the electronic comforts of the new machines. He turned the key. The engine turned over slowly, twice, then caught with a deep, throaty cough, settling into a low, powerful rumble. It was a sound that spoke of mechanical simplicity and raw torque. He let it idle for a full minute, allowing the oil to circulate, listening to the rhythm of the engine. It was a familiar, comforting sound. He eased the tractor forward, driving not toward the Vulcan, but along the firm ridge he had identified. He drove past the stuck machine, circled around, and approached the spot he had chosen. He backed his tractor carefully until its rear tires were resting perfectly on the oak planks Leo had positioned. He had given himself a solid foundation to pull from. He was not on the glue. He was on the oak. Leo dragged the heavy chain over. Arthur got down from the cab. He didn't attach the chain to the Vulcan's designated tow hook, which was buried deep in the mud at the front. Instead, he directed Leo to help him loop the chain around the massive front axle near the wheel. This was another critical detail. Pulling from the axle would create a slight upward lift, not just a forward drag. He was changing the direction of the problem. He attached the other end of the chain to the drawbar of his case. He used heavy steel clevises, checking that the pins were seated correctly. He took his time. There was no rush. Every step was deliberate, a physical manifestation of the lessons learned in this very field. The crowd watched in absolute silence. The farmers, the salesmen, the organizers. They were all transfixed by the old man's methodical process. It was so different from Renshaw's frantic, power-driven attempts. It felt like a ritual. Before getting back into his tractor, Arthur walked over to the cab of the Vulcan 9500. Renshaw was inside, ready to assist. "Just one thing," Arthur said, his voice plain and direct. "Put it in neutral, and don't touch the throttle. Don't try to help. You'll only dig it in deeper. Just steer when it starts to move." Renshaw, humbled and confused, simply nodded. The instruction was counterintuitive. His instinct was to apply power from both machines. But he had seen where his instincts had gotten him. He was no longer the expert here. He was the student. Arthur returned to his cab. He settled into the worn seat, his hands resting on the controls. He could feel the slight vibration of the idling engine through the steel of the machine. He took a deep breath. He looked not at the Vulcan, but at his own front tires, at the chain, at the ground. He engaged the clutch, selecting the lowest possible gear, a creeper gear designed for immense torque at minimal speed. He did not gun the engine. He eased the throttle forward just enough to bring the engine's RPMs up to its peak torque range, a low, steady thrum. He then gently released the clutch. The chain, which had been lying with a slight sag, began to tighten. It rose from the mud, shedding water and dirt, until it was perfectly straight and taut as a guitar string. A low, groaning sound came from the metal links as they took the strain. The Case 1370 did not lurch forward. It hunkered down. The rear tires, pressed against the oak planks, bit hard. The engine's deep rumble deepened into a powerful, resonant growl. For a long moment, nothing else happened. It was a contest of static forces, the torque of the old tractor against the suction of the mud. The crowd held its breath. A few of the farmers exchanged glances of doubt. It seemed nothing was happening. But Arthur felt it. He felt the subtle shift in the load, the point at which the slack was gone and the real work was beginning. He kept the pressure constant, no jerking, no sudden applications of power, just a steady, relentless pull. This was the heart of his father's teaching. Let the torque do the work. Don't force it, persuade it. Then the first sign of success. It wasn't a dramatic movement. It was a slight shudder that ran through the massive frame of the Vulcan 9500. A deep sucking sound, like a giant boot being pulled from thick muck, came from the front left tire, the one Arthur had angled his pull against. A network of fine cracks appeared in the mud around the tire's wall. The crowd saw it, and a collective murmur went through them. They leaned forward, their skepticism beginning to dissolve, replaced by a dawning sense of wonder. Renshaw, in the cab of the Vulcan, felt the shift as a physical jolt. His hands tightened on the steering wheel. He fought the urge to hit the throttle, remembering the old man's simple command. Arthur held the pressure steady. His gaze was unwavering, his hands light on the controls. The Case's engine didn't scream. It dug in, a low, guttural roar of pure mechanical effort. The rear tires didn't spin. They gripped the oak planks, their treads finding the purchase that had been denied to the more advanced tires of the newer machines. The planks themselves pressed down into the mud, distributing the weight and force, preventing Arthur's tractor from digging its own grave. Slowly, agonizingly, the Vulcan's front wheel began to turn, not because its engine was running, but because it was being dragged sideways and upwards out of the rut it had carved. It was a motion of inches, not feet. The mud clung to it, reluctant to release its prize. The sound was a thick, wet tearing. Arthur kept the pull constant. He was now in a deep dialogue with the ground, feeling the resistance, feeding in just enough power to overcome it without breaking traction. It was a delicate balance, an act of profound mechanical empathy. The sideways angle of the pull was the key. Arthur was not fighting the full dead-weight inertia of the 25-ton machine head-on. He was breaking the suction on one corner at a time. By pulling it sideways, he was forcing the tractor to climb the wall of its own rut, lifting it as much as he was pulling it. Lift it up, so it can get on top of the ground. His father's voice echoed in his memory. The front of the Vulcan skewed sideways, its nose tracing a slow arc. Then, with a great, liquid sigh, the entire front axle broke free from the deepest part of the mire. The machine lurched forward a few feet, its front tires now resting on slightly firmer ground. The chain sagged for a moment. Arthur did not stop. He pressed forward, taking up the slack, and continued his slow, creeping pull. Now that the initial suction was broken, the Vulcan moved more easily. It was still a tremendous weight, a dead weight, but it was no longer anchored to the center of the earth. It slid through the mud, a great red ship being dragged from a sandbar. Arthur steered his own tractor in a gentle curve, slowly straightening the angle of the pull as the Vulcan gained momentum and reached the more solid ground of the ridge he had chosen. In less than 5 minutes, the Vulcan 9500 was sitting on the same strip of firm, high ground where Arthur had begun his pull. It was free. Its tires were caked in tons of mud, its gleaming finish was ruined, but it was on solid earth. Arthur eased the throttle, brought his case to a stop, and the sudden quiet was as dramatic as the pull itself. For a moment, nobody moved. The crowd stood in stunned silence. They had witnessed something that defied their understanding of modern farming. They had seen a 50-year-old tractor, with a fraction of the power and a fraction of the weight, succeed where a $500,000 behemoth and its modern brethren had failed utterly. They were not just surprised, they were re-evaluating decades of their own assumptions about what made a machine effective. Renshaw climbed down from the cab of the Vulcan, his face pale. He looked at his freed machine, then at the old, faded case tractor idling placidly a few yards away. He looked at the deep, gouged ruts left by his own failed attempts, and then at the clean, direct path of the rescue. He saw the simple chain, the mud-caked planks. The evidence of his failure and Arthur's success was laid out before him on the canvas of the field. His arrogance was gone, replaced by a profound and humbling confusion. He had relied on specifications, on horsepower, on technology. Arthur had relied on something else, something older and deeper. The silence was finally broken not by a cheer, but by a slow, spreading wave of applause. It was not the boisterous applause of a sporting event. It was quiet, respectful, almost reverent. It was the sound of farmers acknowledging a master of their craft. They were not applauding the machine. They were applauding the man. They were applauding the knowledge that had just been so quietly and powerfully demonstrated. Arthur simply set the parking brake and shut off the case's engine. The work was done. He climbed down from the cab, his movements as unhurried as they had been when he started. The applause did not seem to register with him. He was already focused on the next task, cleaning his equipment. The success could be quantified, and the men in the crowd, farmers to their core, began to do the math in their heads and in quiet conversations. The Vulcan 9500 weighed approximately 50,000 pounds. Its engine was rated at 500 horsepower. The Case 1370, by contrast, weighed around 17,000 pounds, and its engine, when new, had been rated at 156 horsepower. By the simple logic of force and mass that governed modern engineering, what had just happened was impossible. The smaller tractor should not have been able to generate enough traction to move the larger one, let alone pull it from such a deep mire. Renshaw's own sales pitch had been built around these numbers. He spoke of drawbar pull, of hydraulic flow, of technological superiority proven by data. Now his data was meaningless. An old man with an obsolete machine had rewritten the equation. The variable that Renshaw had left out, the one Arthur understood completely, was the ground itself. The knowledge of the specific, tangible earth beneath the wheels had proven to be more powerful than all the horsepower his company could manufacture. As the crowd began to disperse, talking in low, amazed tones, Mark Renshaw walked across the muddy grass. He did not go to his colleagues or to the show manager. He walked directly toward Arthur Croft. Arthur and Leah were at the back of the case, preparing to disconnect the heavy chain. Arthur was scraping the thickest clumps of mud from the links with a small trowel he kept in his toolbox. It was a simple act of maintenance, of respect for the tool. Renshaw stopped a few feet away, waiting for Arthur to look up. He was no longer the slick, confident salesman. He looked like a man who had just seen a magic trick and was desperate to understand how it was done. "Mr. Croft," he began, his voice quiet, stripped of its earlier bravado. Arthur looked up. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement, and then returned to his work on the chain. Renshaw started, then stopped. He took a breath. "I don't understand how you did that." he said, the words coming out in a plain, honest rush. My machine has 3 times the power, more than double the weight. We tried with 2 tractors. By all the numbers, it shouldn't have been possible. He looked at the old case, then back at Arthur. I was wrong, he said. The admission was simple, direct, and clearly cost him a great deal of his professional pride. I was rude. I apologize. Arthur finished cleaning a link of the chain and looked at the young man. He saw not the arrogant salesman from before, but someone genuinely seeking understanding. He straightened up, wiping his hands on an old rag from his pocket. He didn't smile or gloat. He simply prepared to state the facts as he knew them. The numbers ain't the whole story, Arthur said, his voice as calm and unadorned as the rest of him. They never are. He gestured with his chin toward the mired field. Your mistake wasn't in the machine. It was in the ground. You saw dirt. You didn't see the clay beneath it. This field holds water when you put that much weight on it. He pointed to the Vulcan. And spin the tires. You're not digging for traction. You're digging a hole. That machine was heavy, so it dug a deep one. It became its own anchor. He walked a few steps, and Renshaw followed. Arthur pointed to the ruts. You tried to pull it straight out. You were fighting the anchor head-on. All your power was just pulling it deeper into the wall of the rut you'd already made. He then pointed to the path his own tractor had taken. I didn't pull from the front. I pulled from the side, from an angle. The goal wasn't to drag it forward. The goal was to break the suction on that one side, to lift it up and out of the hole it was in. You don't fight the mud. You work with it. You peel it away. He kicked at the turf on the ridge. And I pulled from here, higher ground, firmer. My tires were on those oak planks. They weren't on the slick clay. I gave myself purchase before I even started to pull. My tractor wasn't fighting the ground. It was anchored to it. He looked Renshaw in the eye. It wasn't about horsepower, he said, echoing the words his father had spoken to him almost 40 years earlier. It was about purchase. Your machine was in neutral. All it did was steer. My tractor did the work. A slow, steady pull. Let the torque do the talking. No spinning. Spinning is surrender. Renshaw listened, his expression intent. He was absorbing a lesson that no engineering textbook or corporate training seminar had ever contained. It was a lesson in humility, in observation, and in the primacy of the natural world over the machines designed to tame it. The complex problem that had baffled his company's best technology had been solved by a set of simple, elegant principles. My father taught me that, Arthur added quietly, on this same piece of land. Renshaw was silent for a long moment, processing the information. He looked around the fairgrounds, at all the gleaming, powerful machines, at the confident salesmen in their company shirts. He realized that for all their technical knowledge, they were missing a fundamental piece of the puzzle. They knew their machines, but they did not know the ground. Can I? Renshaw hesitated. Would you mind if I wrote some of this down? He pulled a small notebook and a pen from his shirt pocket. He, a man of digital displays and performance metrics, was resorting to the most basic form of record-keeping. Arthur gave a slight shrug. They're just facts. The ground doesn't change. Renshaw began to sketch the scene in his notebook, the position of the stuck tractor, the angle of Arthur's cape, placement of the planks. He wrote down Arthur's words. Purchase, not power. Lift it up and out. Don't fight the mud. He knew this was more than just a tip for extracting a stuck vehicle. It was a different philosophy of farming, a different way of seeing the relationship between machine and land. He told Arthur that the company's operators' manuals had a section on vehicle recovery, but it was all about using winches and other heavy equipment. It assumed a problem of force. We need to rewrite that chapter, Renshaw said, more to himself than to Arthur. We need a chapter on mud. The knowledge, once dismissed and ridiculed, was now being formally recorded. destined to be absorbed into the institutional memory of the very company that had scorned it. The quiet wisdom of Samuel Croft, passed down to his son, was about to find its way into a corporate manual, a systemic change sparked by one old tractor and one old man's refusal to forget what was true. By now, Leo had managed to disconnect the heavy chain. Arthur folded it carefully, link by link, and laid it in the back of his old Ford pickup truck. He and Leo then lifted the heavy, mud-soaked oak planks and slid them in beside it. Arthur ran his hand over the worn, splintered wood of one of the planks. It was a tool, but it was also a repository of memory, a symbol of a kind of knowledge that endured. Like the tractor, it was not obsolete. It was merely waiting for the right conditions to prove its timeless utility. The day was ending. The rain had stopped, and the setting sun was breaking through the clouds, casting long shadows across the ruined demonstration field. The farm show was unofficially over. The spectacle had reached its quiet, unexpected conclusion. Arthur's success had not become a loud celebration, but a subject of quiet, thoughtful discussion. As he and Leo prepared to leave, a few of the older farmers who had been in the crowd earlier drifted over. They did not come to congratulate him in a loud way. They came over with a newfound respect. Henderson, the man who had made the initial joke, walked up and just looked at the Case 1370, his eyes tracing the lines of the engine block. "That old girl's still got some pull in her, Arthur," he said, his voice low and sincere. Another farmer asked about the tires, a specific question about the tread depth and the pressure Arthur kept them at. A third just nodded at Arthur, a gesture of profound, wordless acknowledgement. The tractor was no longer a museum piece in their eyes. It was a legend. It had a story now, and they had been there to witness it. It had become part of the local lore. Arthur answered their questions with his usual brevity, giving them the simple, factual numbers they asked for. Then he turned to his grandson. He took the keys to the case from his pocket, a single, worn brass key on a simple metal ring, and held them out to Leo. "You drive it home," he said. Leo looked at the key in his grandfather's hand, then up at his grandfather's face. He understood. This was more than just a request to drive. It was a transfer. It was an acknowledgement that he had watched, he had listened, and he had understood the lesson of the day. He had seen the principle in action. He took the key, his hand closing around the cool metal. He nodded, his expression as serious and solemn as the moment required. He was no longer just the boy who helped his grandfather. He was the successor, the next keeper of the knowledge. Arthur walked to his truck and got in, waiting to follow the tractor home. Leo climbed up into the high cab of the Case 1370. He started the engine, its deep rumble now sounding to him like the voice of history. He eased it into gear and drove it slowly out of the fairgrounds, leaving the gleaming, defeated Vulcan 9500 behind. He drove with a focus and care that showed he had absorbed not just the instructions, but the philosophy behind them. As Arthur watched his grandson drive the old tractor down the lane, he felt a quiet sense of rightness. The chain and the planks were put away. The tractor was safe. The knowledge was secure. It had been tested and proven true once more, not against the ignorance of the past, but against the arrogance of the future. A machine, he thought, is only a tool. Its true power is not in its engine, but in the mind of the person who operates it, in their understanding of the ground beneath it. Some knowledge does not grow old or become obsolete. It simply waits, patient as the seasons, for the right kind of rain to prove it is still true.